You're listening to the Anthology Towns That Were, an episodic narrative podcast. Follow us on YouTube, twitter.com/townsthatwere, soundcloud.com/townsthatwere, and the Anthology Towns That Were on facebook.com. We hope you enjoy.
Three years to the day since the war started. Prohibition is alive and well in West Virginia. Not that it impacted Malediction. War and such ideals seem far away from this place. This town seems untouched by the realities of this world. War here is a different monster, different from the war out there. Malediction has known its fair share of fights. While there is talk of war coming to America, murmurs in the streets and on the radio, Johnny feels no fear. If he's called to fight, then he will fight, just as his ancestors had done. Malediction is a small, private town, cloaked by the forest, guarded by Lake Ophelia. The people here do things their own way, always have. They protect each other, and in a way larger than they know, they shield the world from the war that comes from within their very borders. Johnny's place here is an inherited one, not so much a position given any title. Some would call him chief or sheriff. Others would say he's the mayor. Most people just call him Johnny or Jack, after his father. The people of Malediction respect him, trust him. They know of the troubles he carries and are grateful. Johnny's knowledge is their blissful ignorance. Each morning, Johnny walks his dog along the shoreline of Lake Ophelia. He watches the sun rise over the island that sits carefully in the middle of the lake. Every morning since he was a child, he has carried out this tradition. He's done so with his father, and he will continue to do so with his own son. He was made to believe this was a family tradition. His father would tell him stories of the island, how it takes things and holds on to them. The town will tell of the terrible accident that happened on the island nearly 100 years prior. Something so terrible it shouldn't be mentioned. But Johnny's come to understand the truth. The truth was in his father's words. The island does take things and hold on to them. It took his ancestors, his father, and his father before him. One day, Johnny believes it will take him too. He stares quietly at the island now, the dog wading into the clouded waters. He's had the coonhound for 2 years now. She's a tracker, like him. He believes that's why they get along so well. Sasha chases the water's edge, walking into the water, swimming for a bit, though she always hurries back to shore. Johnny watches her funny habit, never going out too far, 1 foot always in the sand. He'd found the pup near the coal mines, covered in slag and soot. She was such a tiny thing, fitting in both his hands. She'd never cried, not even a whimper. He brought her home, cleaned her off, uncovering a sea of speckles and spots on her red coat. Her ears are crooked. He thought she'd grow into them, but she never did. One stands nearly upright, while the other hangs down. Clumsy at first, Sasha quickly grew out of it, finding ways to always be at Johnny's heel. She's the reason he's not yet seen the island for himself. Every time he gets the boat ready to head out, the dog loses her senses, as if she's protecting him from something. He feels lost near the waters, it's true. and Sasha keeps him grounded to the sands. Today, there's no exception to this behavior. Johnny feels especially drawn to the lake, feeling as if his mind wanders off on its own, carried away in the waves. He cleans out the small boat that sits, tied down to a tree near the beaten path leading him home. Cobwebs and sand coat the inside. This afternoon is cool compared to the hot nights preceding it, and the lake sits perfectly still. Johnny checks his pockets, making sure he has his necessities: some rolled cigarettes, a lighter, and an old knife handed down to him from his father. That's all he ever really needs. He glances to Sasha as she sniffs wildly, digging into the sand. She's getting restless, but Johnny feels tonight may be different. He whistles loudly as she comes running. He scoops her up into his arms and places her in the boat, watching her sit pointed straight ahead towards the island, a low, guttural growl rumbling up from her chest. She doesn't cry, not even when he found her barely alive in the mines. But her growl makes him feel uneasy, soft at first, growing loud as he unties the boat from its makeshift harbor. Sasha keeps her eyes fixed on the island, but makes no move to leap from the boat. Johnny whispers to her, reassures her. He pats her head with one hand as he pushes the boat onto the water, still as glass. He rows cautiously, the whole way telling Sasha of his plans. He tells her of his great-grandfather, and she never turns away from the island. She must know his story by now. Even Johnny tires of it. The entire town knows the tale, the accident. Johnny's great-grandfather, John, went to the island and never came back. Most people say he ate something strange to make him behave the way he did, to take his own life, out there at the Cove. Johnny's grandfather, however, adamantly refused their claims. Great-grandfather John was a provider for the town, the only one who would go to the island, gathering there month after month. He would know the difference between good and bad. Grandpa Jack had gone to the island and returned. Some feared he wouldn't, with good reason. He had children late in life, and when Johnny was born, his grandfather was quite old. The old man blamed the island for taking his father. He blamed himself for giving him the knife that did it. Johnny's grandfather always spoke of the island taking from their family, and he too died there. Like an old animal, he wandered there when his time came, laid down beneath a tree and left this world for another. It broke the town's heart to see him go like that, but it was the way he wanted. Johnny knew that feeling all too well. His father had wanted to go to that island more than anything. He talked about it day and night, sometimes for weeks on end, and his mother would brush it aside. She didn't like the place. She didn't like the omen it carried. Johnny tells himself it was the curiosity that drew the men of his family there, or just damn pride. It was pride that had taken his father, he knew that. It was his need to beat the island that became his undoing. Johnny had no intentions of following in those footsteps. He didn't see the island as some monster, some foreboding entity. It was just some place that sent his father into such a fearful panic that, like those before, he ended his own life there. Johnny stops rowing near the middle of the lake, with the island in front of him and Malediction to his back. He glances back to her, his town, and Sasha does too. The bell chimes as the door swings shut behind Rayla, nearly 1 year before James Grayson arrives in Malediction. The air has found a chill earlier than normal this year, a gust following Rayla into the home of the Malediction Monthly. Doug and Melanie Wilson, husband and wife, chief and only journalists of Malediction, scowl as the frigid air interrupts their discussion. They turn back to one another, their desks butted up against each other so that they can bicker face to face without losing sight of the work before them. They acknowledge Rayla with a small nod before returning to their writings, growing accustomed to seeing her each and every day. She weaves through the piles of old papers covering the littered floors, making her way to what the Wilsons call the archives, though it's no more than a desk with piles of paper that, as Rayla's come to find, may or may not be ordered by date. She rummages through countless years of Malediction's anniversaries, parades, festivals, years of pride similar to what she'd felt when she'd been sworn in under Sheriff Taylor. But that pride has since drifted, leaving in its place an absence, a fleeting regret of a decision she'd never made. She combs through more misdemeanors than she can count, usually making the headlines as nothing more than small-town gossip. In a place where everybody knows everybody, the bad gets folks talking more than the good. She flips through generations of obituaries, from time to time losing herself in the beautifully written remembrances of fallen family members. 2 weeks, she tells herself. 2 weeks you've been searching for something, anything, and you've found nothing similar to what you saw, though why would she? She can't think of anyone in their right mind who would report what she'd seen to anyone. Then again, she can't imagine anyone in their right mind would have seen the things she had. Rayla loses focus, realizing entirely too late that, lost in her own thoughts, her fingers continued to comb through the useless piles before her. Her place lost, she tosses the stack of documents back upon their table and falls back upon the smoke-filled cushions of a disgustingly brown office chair. For a moment, she's lost in the maze of stains that swirl along the displaced ceiling tiles, following them as they flow gracefully across the room like the river that leads into Lake Ophelia. "That's it," she shouts aloud. She hears the bickering of Doug and Melanie come to a brief halt, returning to its normal consistency when they realize they're not needed. Rayla scoots erratically, breaking the wheels of the office chair free from their rusty shackles as she scoots back to the archive table. She pulls a stack of papers toward her, disorganizing them more so than they already were, and flips wildly through the pile that she'd mentally labeled finished. If the Wilsons could see the mess she's made, Rayla would never hear the end of it. She tosses the papers aside, all but one. Diane and Jason Anderson married at the Grayson cabin, the title reads. Gloria Grayson, Rayla thinks. It's been nearly 10 years since she'd seen the woman, since she set foot on the Grayson estate. How would she react, seeing me on the front porch, she thinks. But Rayla knows the answer, knows Gloria Grayson. She wouldn't turn her back on Rayla, even if it had been 20 years. She folds the page, sticking it into her coat pocket, and bursts through the door quickly as she'd entered. Doug Wilson stares blankly, eyes wide like a deer caught in the headlights. She knows, he tells his wife. Not yet, she says, already tired of the conversation, of her husband's theories. But she knows he's right, one way or another. The girl may not know, not now, but she will. Melanie knows Gloria Grayson, too protective for her own good. Melanie considers herself a realist. She knows this town, better perhaps than most others, She knows where righteousness will get you. Right where it landed Gloria Grayson's brother, their father before them. Sooner than later, it will catch up with Rayla Marsh. Two weeks prior, Rayla turns off the radio in her cruiser. She's had it with the constant chatter between her fellow deputies. In fact, she's had it with the entire force. She winds wildly through the mountainous roads of Malediction without regard for her surroundings. Her headlights cut through the pitch-black forest along the roadside, now heading towards her third domestic disturbance call in the past 3 weeks. She's certain the sheriff is punishing her. For what, though, she's still unsure. Her frustration is eased by the beauty of her surroundings. Rayla's been through every emotional phase come to be expected regarding her hometown, from teen angst to the bitterness she'd felt when her parents moved west. From the bitterness of being trapped in such a town to the pride she felt the day she'd been deputized. Now, though, as she chases the curves of the white line, she's nearly blinded by the growing appreciation for the town that's molded her, for better and for worse. Blinded so much so that Rayla nearly misses the lithe shadow as it bolts before her vehicle, vanishing into the night with a lengthy bound down the side of the mountain alongside her cruiser. The first tree snaps Rayla's head back into the rest of her seat, falling back towards the steering wheel as her car nosedives down the steep mountainside. The second tree sends her cruiser into a jolting topple, smashing the driver's side door in a jagged point that splits open Rayla's thigh, shards of the shattered windows littering her hair like snowfall. The third tree stops the car in place, battering Rayla unconscious. When she wakes, a fierce wind howls through the smashed windows of Rayla's cruiser. Upside down, her seatbelt holding her in place, she fidgets with the scanner, flipping toggles and turning knobs as if she's forgotten how to use the equipment. She squeezes the trigger and screams hoarsely into the unit, hearing only static on the other end. She lets go of the microphone. It bounces on its spiral cord once, twice, 3 times before quietly settling back into place. Rayla unclips her seatbelt, her head smashing against the roof of the car before she has time to catch herself, falling in a confusing manner. Her knees press to her chest, and her shriek echoes through the forest as the gash on her thigh splits further open, like the widening crack of an earthquake. The sleeve of her jacket, cut with the worn pocket knife she carries, seals the wound miserably, but she finds herself just able to drag herself from the broken window and lift herself from the ground, wheezing as she leans against the smoking car. From the outside, somehow, the crash looks worse than it felt, worse than it feels. The tires continue spinning on their broken and bent axle, the body of the car bent into a V shape. She cranes her neck to look up the steep hill, though the canopy, concealed by the darkness of the night, blocks the view of the road. She considers her radio once more, before remembering the static response she'd received on her first attempt, and limps cautiously further into the woods. Rayla knows where her car had careened into the forest, but there's no way in telling how far her car had toppled down the steep slope. Somewhere in the mountains above the Gibson farms and below the Dixon homestead, where she'd been headed, she assumes. She doesn't know these woods like those that border Lake Ophelia. In this light, she may never find her way, but on she hobbles, leaning against every tree along the way, waiting for her leg to give out, leaving her helpless on the forest floor. When her vision comes to, Rayla has no awareness of her surroundings. Not that she had in the first place, though she'd made a conscious effort to memorize any notable surroundings she passed. Before her stands a stone outcropping, jutting from the mountainside like a firm hand, grasping at her as if to pull her into its wall and hold her for the rest of eternity. The rock stands nearly 10 feet high, coming to a sharp point before her like a massive arrowhead. There's no mistaking this as a landmark she'd possibly passed before. In fact, it's one that she's certain she's never seen through her life here in Malediction. A break from the wind, only for a little, she thinks. Her bones seem to crackle with the cold with each move she makes, the wound on her leg numb from the chilly night. She stumbles around the rock face, hoping only to shield herself from the winds. Before she knows, Rayla is lost within the cracks of the mountainside, not remembering entering. Behind her, the light of the moon is no longer visible, overwhelmed by darkness. She hasn't the slightest idea of how far she's traveled beneath the lands above her. She runs her hand along the coarse stone, letting her feet fall gently upon the uneven ground. Each misstep sends throbs up her leg, into her hip and lower back, nearly dropping her to her knees. She continues, however, not sure why or where, but she walks, as if resting will be the end, as if moving forward is the only thing keeping her alive. Rayla can feel the rough stone scratching and scraping at her palm. She feels the blood loose from beneath her skin and smear against the stone walls. It doesn't faze her, however, the slight pain diminishing the piercing from her leg. The corridor widens into a circular, albeit uneven chamber, and she can see. More so than when her eyes adjusted to the blackness. It's different, she knows. Slightly more than halfway up the arced wall of the cavern, a modest hole leaves room for the starry night to seep into the small chamber, the moon's rays landing perfectly, uncannily even, on a stone dais too smooth and even to be a natural formation. Speckles of dust and debris catch in the light's rays, fleeing as Rayla's hand slowly dips through the light, settling back into place after a short while. She follows the light to the stone podium, admiring the structure tucked deep within the hills of Malediction, and when she stops, her legs burn, her head aches, and she finds herself somewhat surprised to find the ability to stand. Atop the formation before her, she's lost within the circular etchings tirelessly scratched into its surface. There's something familiar about them, something extraordinary. "I know you," she whispers, unaware of the words escaping her, unaware of their meaning, their origin. She can't remember, perhaps, but she thinks, she feels, as if she truly does know them. Rayla rests her hands upon the dais, tracing the etchings slowly with her gentle fingers. The lines guide her, reverberating against the trail of blood left behind from her scraped palm, adjusting to what it's waited so long to taste. Slowly, at first, her blood spirals upon the facing, fluorescent in the light of the moon. Surprised by the amount of blood seemingly occupying the grooves before her, she pulls her hand free, finding her hand smooth, clean, free from the lacerations from the mountainside. Though her hand is renewed, a weariness overtakes her, feeling the loss of what was taken from her, and her legs finally collapse, sending her to the ground. and the light of the moon slowly fades with her senses. She tries to scream, but bubbles rise, clouding the vision before her eyes. Her surroundings are dark, murky, and she sees the light of the moon refracted against the gentle waves of Lake Ophelia at least 20 feet above her head. She screams again to no avail, tasting the thick waters on her tongue, feeling the burning of her lungs expanding. Regardless of her struggle, no matter how hard she kicks or how furiously she flails her arms, the surface remains distant, insulting her, like a guard mocking her as she attempts to break her cell bars. There's no escape, no freedom, no hope. Rayla hears her father. "Kick," he tells her, "you can do it." But she knows she can't. Not here. Wherever she's found herself is a prison, keeping her locked within the torment of fear, somewhere dismally between the surface just out of arm's reach and drowning, neither at her disposal. As her neck cranes back, arms reaching towards the surface, a darkness wisps past, momentarily blocking the light of the surface, the same that she'd seen on the mountain roads. Again, it flashes before her, closer now as it circles. She feels the current it brings in its wake, spiraling up around her backside, circling her torso and chest, blurring the waters even more so before her eyes. Eyes, she thinks. She can see them. She can see both of them, a deep red, each nearly twice the size of her in the distance. Their gaze drifts along the waters, shedding a dangerous red glow upon anything they pass, like the spotlights of the prison she's found herself within, looking only to detect her, share her unwelcome presence with what lies beneath the surface. Fashioned oddly, they simultaneously land on her, as if controlled by two different entities. When they find her, though, they find their balance, widening in a fearful delight. The blinding brightness sends the creaking of her lungs to the back of her head. As her eyes adjust, she finds the silhouette, even darker than the lake itself, tucked behind the pair of eyes. Its multiple extensions wriggle and squirm for what appears to be hundreds of feet to each side, keeping it afloat as it keeps its stare affixed on Rayla. She can see indescribable textures along the shadow, craters and pockmarks littering the form. She can see them moving individually against the swaying shape. High above the form rests a large landmass, its underbelly coming to a point beneath the waters of Lake Ophelia like an iceberg or the roots of the largest tree, spiraling amongst the currents, twisting and entwining with one another. She'd not seen it there before, and questions how she does now, as if seeing the world from two differing perspectives simultaneously. She follows the roots down from the mass of land floating on the lake, follows them like the dingy stains on the Wilson ceiling, follows them like the perfect spirals carved upon the dais buried deep within the hills of Malediction. She follows them as they twist together in multiple, thick appendages, wrapping around the body that watches her so diligently. Protect the Cove, she thinks. Or maybe she hears, carried away in the currents. Protect the Cove. She knows she can't do anything. Not trapped in a place like this, caught somewhere between death and freedom, wondering what the difference truly is. Locked away. The words ebb and flow in rhythm with the water circling her. Locked away and forgotten. The presence of the words is frightening, perilous, as if they fight eagerly to hold her under, to keep her from returning to her town. She feels their weight, heavier than the waters, pulling her under, but something holds them back. Something keeps their anger at bay, unwillingly, but enough to allow her to hear the voice. Locked away you've kept, lying dormant, darkness slept. Rayla comes to with the moonlight washing over her face, the light straining her eyes against the darkness of the cave. She finds herself once more distracted by the swirling dust within the rays of light. The words she'd heard echoed in her mind, like the remnants of a terrible dream. However, her clothes, drenched and heavy, convince her otherwise. The weight of her clothes nearly weighs her down as she sits, a murky puddle forming on the cavern's ground. Her lungs burn, though she stands with an ease that surprises her. Rayla opens the hole torn in her pants, finding her wound sealed shut, a white scar where it had recently been torn and bloody. Atop the stone dais, the etchings remain, beautifully symmetrical. Her blood has been washed away. The water stirs gently around the small boat carrying Johnny and Sasha. They both gaze back at their home, Malediction. Johnny feels his mind wander. He sees his beautiful home, the only place he has ever really known. He's rarely ventured beyond its borders, always drifting back to its embrace. Sasha must feel the same way. She turns fully around and tiptoes to the other side of the boat, as close as she can get to her home. She stays standing on all fours. Johnny doesn't notice. He's lost in his own mind, in the sound of the waves of Lake Ophelia. He doesn't notice the heavy sway of the boat. He doesn't notice the splash. He doesn't notice the rope hanging tight from the end of the boat. It takes Johnny a full minute to come back to reality. It takes him another minute to realize what's happening. Sasha went into the water. Whether it was intention to go in is unclear. She's a good swimmer, but as Johnny throws his body over the side of the boat, he can see her submerged. He reaches into the water. It's cold and a thin veil of ice covers the top. Johnny scans the water around the boat, all covered in ice. Impossible. But he has no time to ponder this. He reaches into his pocket and pulls from it a knife, crudely made, dented on the handle and blade, wrapped in old tattered leather. He finds the rope, taut against the boat, and cuts at it furiously. In his panic, he cuts his finger. Just as blood begins to trickle down his wet fingers, the ice disappears from the lake's surface, and Sasha reemerges from its depth. He pulls her onto the boat and into his arms. He unwraps the rope from around her front legs. She pants heavily but does not cry. Johnny rocks her in his arms, out of breath himself. He speaks to her softly as he dries her face with his hands. Once the chaos of the past few moments subsides, Johnny remembers the icy chill of the lake and looks around the boat again. He leans over the side to touch the water. It's warm, typical for July. As he stares at the water, his fingertips penetrating the surface, He sees the blood dripping from his hand. He watches as it pulls away from his body and goes off on its own. Like a snake, it slithers through the ripples of Lake Ophelia and toward the island. Johnny follows the trail. He feels adrenaline pump through his veins as he quarrels with his fight or flight reflexes. Graysons don't run from danger, he reminds himself as he picks up the oar. Just as he begins to push the boat towards the island, he looks down at Sasha, still soaking wet on the floor of the boat. She looks up at him from her spot she is curled up in. Johnny pulls the oar back into the boat and relaxes. A warmth of affection rushes over him. How could he take his scared friend to a place she fears so much? Surely his curiosity isn't so strong he'd risk her well-being over it. Sasha stands and more carefully than she has ever moved, strides toward him. She rests her head in his lap and nudges his hand, still holding the oar. I just have to know what it's like, he says to her, patting her head softly, watching her close her eyes as he once again moves the boat toward land. It feels like it takes merely seconds to reach their destination. Johnny pulls the boat onto the grassy sand, not sure if it'll take off on its own if he leaves it in the water. Sasha sits patiently and waits for the movement to stop. Once Johnny is sure the boat is secure, he looks at his companion and pats his leg for her to come to him. Sasha stays seated, looking past him into the thick, dense forest. Johnny tries to coax her from her spot to no avail. He nods knowingly and turns on his heels toward the forest and walks off alone. Johnny walks silently into the forest. He feels the earth crack beneath his feet, but hears no sound. He looks up at the green and colorful canopy of the trees around him. The warm sun peeking through, lightening up the lively flowers and moss along the tree trunks. He continues to walk through the serenity until he reaches a clearing in the forest. He finds a fallen tree near him and sits down. Johnny closes his eyes, trying to imagine his father here. He wonders if he took the same path as he did so many years ago. Thinking of his father here reminds Johnny of the stories he was told, how there's no sound here. He listens carefully. He knows he must have heard birds chirping on his walk, but now can't recall even the sound of crickets. Sitting on this log, in silence, Johnny feels uneasy. There's nothing. He opens his eyes and looks around quickly. How could there be nothing? He shakes his head, trying to rid the paranoid thoughts his father planted there. He stands on his feet and stretches, looking again at the canopy of color above him. Then he notices sharp, strange branches. He follows them to a black tree. He has never seen a black tree, and something so odd would have been mentioned by his father. He walks toward it. He walks past a bed of flowers and rocks, and as he reaches the tree, he hears a thumping in his ears. A vicious headache creeps up his spine into the back of his skull. He pauses a moment, grabbing his head with both hands, but the feeling subsides quickly, strangely. He once again moves toward the blackened tree. Reaching it, this close he can see marks beneath the bark. Circles and spirals cover the trunk. He reaches into his pocket for his knife. Johnny places his wounded hand against the tree and inserts his knife under the bark. He pries it off, uncovering more circles and spirals. They engulf the tree like a sickness. He traces the markings with his fingertip. He passes over the rough edges of the indentations and pulls his hand away, revealing a splinter in his wound. As he removes the piece of wood from his hand, he hears a loud groan fill the air. The first noise other than his own in this peaceful place. Johnny turns away from the tree and looks into the forest surrounding him. Nothing. He stands deathly still for a few moments. Then, like pinpricks on his skin, he feels drops of rain. Confused, he looks around. Rain couldn't have come so quickly, not on a night like this. He turns back to the tree, sees it spotted with wet droplets, and as he reaches out to touch them, he pulls his hand back and gazes at it, red. He looks to the wound on his hand, unsure if the cut was much deeper than he thought. Black. Black as the tree in front of him, as sky in a thunderstorm. He pinches his cut. It oozes nothing but ash. Shocked and amazed, Johnny stumbles backwards. Again, he looks up at the tree. He watches as the tips of the branches vibrate violently and shiver down to the trunk. The tree lurches and groans, as if awakening from a sleep. Its bark peels from the trunk and falls to the dead ground. The peace of this place shudders away with it. Johnny walks further backward until his heels hit the fallen trunk and his knees buckle under his own weight. He sits down, cradles his head in his hands, and rocks back and forth. He rocks until he can no longer hear the yelling of the dead tree. Rocks until he feels a wet nose against his hand. He rocks until he feels nothing at all. Johnny, numb from all things, looks up and sees his dog, his companion, wiggling her way into his arms. He sits up straight and lets her climb her small body into his lap. He looks down at her, knows he should love her, but he doesn't. He thinks of leaving her here. He thinks of getting up and walking silently back to his boat and rowing back to Malediction alone. The thought of her by herself here does not bother him. He thinks about going home and burning the place to the ground. He thinks about leaving the rubble of the only place he's ever known behind. These thoughts seem angry and vindictive, but he feels none of these things. Johnny doesn't feel anything at all. He feels a void. He looks at the blackened tree, now glistening and red. He watches as the light catches the spots of blood along the trunk and dances through the circles of the engravements. He rubs ash on his hand, ash that comes from him. He finds this place peaceful now, not scary or haunting. He looks around and understands. He knows what this place is for, and he knows what kind of man he is, or rather, what kind of man he isn't. Johnny tries to stand, letting Sasha nearly slide off his lap. He walks toward Lake Ophelia, toward his boat perched by a sign that reads, Dead Man's Cove. He walks until he hears a sound. He hears crying. He turns around to see Sasha, head down as a deep whimper comes up from her chest. Johnny's own eyes well with tears. He runs to her, scoops her into his arm and kisses her head. He cries as he carries her to the boat and rows towards Malediction, towards his home.
The anthology, Towns That Were, is written by Michael and Jackie Gormley, narrated by Michael Gormley. Music and sound from David Hyde, Free to Use Sounds, The Dark Piano, Purple Planet Music, and our music box.